From Adams Morgan to Anacostia Park, we all want safer neighborhoods. But what does real safety mean? Real safety means preventing crime before it happens. By having police work with communities to disrupt cycles of violence, by supporting families with stable housing, and providing more mental health and drug treatment. We know that adding more police and locking up more people doesn't make us safer. Real safety means investing in the things that help prevent crime. Learn more at realsafetydc.
Hi there again, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm diving back into Philip Knightley and his writing on the Vietnam War, particularly on the war reporting of the Vietnam War. Philip Knightley, of course, one of the journalists on the Sunday Times Insight team, who in 1967 broke the story that the defector to the Soviet Union that had been kind of mentioned and rumored and talked about was in none other than MI6's head of counterintelligence, Kim Philby. And he wrote an excellent biography of Philby, and in later life came to know Philby quite well, visited him in Moscow. The First Casualty is Philip Knightley's kind of seminal work on war reporting, and he writes a lot about Vietnam, obviously for good reason. And previously, we talked about the difficulties and the opportunities that American journalists had in Vietnam in accessing, actual verifiable facts, and how the kind of embedded journalist, the managed journalist, that became in some ways complicit with the with propaganda and the kind of the various lies and deceptions that the American military employed, was that we see later in sort of every modern war, is something trialed and pioneered in Vietnam. So here we're going to look today at how British war correspondents fared in Vietnam, and they had a slightly different experience, partly because they are not embedded in the same way. So Philip Knightley writes, British correspondents were better placed to write about Vietnam than were their American colleagues, just as later Americans were better placed to write the truth about Northern Ireland. But the British press seemed reluctant to get deeply involved. The Times would send a man only infrequently, and until the paper's change of ownership in 1967, would never allow him to stay long enough. A criticism equally valid of the Observer. The Sunday Times sent someone only at long intervals. The Daily Mail hardly ever, the Guardian only seldom. The Daily Telegraph had the most regular coverage. However, John Dorr, the Daily Telegraph correspondent in Saigon, who reported events leading up to the retreat of the South Vietnamese army in March to the April 1975, was actually Captain Nguyen Ngoc Phac, aide to the Chief of Staff of the South Vietnamese Army. With the exception of the Telegraph and the Times, both of which aimed at producing a daily record of the war, British papers tended to give news coverage to Vietnam only when the war flared up. The Daily Express is an example of this. The Daily Mirror, like the Express, had a man in Saigon at frequent intervals, but from 1966, when the Mirror decided that it was against the war, it also sent feature writer John Pilger, who once or twice a year to write his own very personal view of the war. Obviously, John Pilger, partly as a result of the Vietnam War and partly as a result of much greater opportunities for foreign correspondents to travel the world and to write freely than exist now, became one of the sort of celebrated journalistic figures of the left in the second half of the 20th century. He died last year, and leaves behind him an enormous body of work, but it was informed. Most of everything else he did, if you read his work, was informed by the kind of the searing seminal experience of seeing the crimes against humanity in Vietnam, the carpet bombing of South and North Vietnam by B-52 aircraft. Pilger's attitude was that Vietnam was a new type of war, impossible to cover without becoming part of it, without it becoming part of yourself. Impossible to cover without becoming part of it yourself. And when you become part of it, you have to decide where you stand. And I suppose when you have a war that is fought first by France and then by America to prevent the reunion of North and South Vietnam, and essentially the conclusion of a struggle for national liberation, it becomes, as a result, hundreds of thousands of civilians die. It becomes very difficult to stand in the middle of all of that and view it as a kind of a sterile and impartial kind of process. It becomes very difficult to look at the events around you in that way. Pilger made his stand clear in a series of articles on what the war was doing to Vietnamese civilians, which the Sunday Mirror launched with the front page headline, "How can Britain support a war like this?" The Mirror is kind of, for those that don't absorb Britain's media, the Mirror is a working class newspaper, sort of. It is on the left, sort of. It's a tabloid newspaper. It has never had the power and influence that the Sun, the Rupert Murdoch's hard right newspaper, has had in Britain. It has had periods where it's more vocally articulated the left, and yet it's the same kind of garbage celebrity rag with periodic lurches into kind of reactionary politics of its very own. So it's hardly a kind of left publication by any stretch of the imagination, but it has had moments where it takes particular stances on foreign policy, and it was one of the first to break ranks over Vietnam, but that's in the 60s, and the Mirror's politics went into rapid decline throughout the 1980s. When Pilger's Vietnam reporting won 2 major British awards, his critics said his work was emotional and anti-American. He replied that it was anti-war rather than anti-American, and that the charge of emotional reporting usually came from correspondents who had been so long exposed to the war that their compassion had been deadened. In fairness to him, he spent a lot of time, I think it's in his book Heroes, with American veterans of the war and assessing and exploring and discovering and giving voice to the trauma and the harm that they had come to, as well as the horrors inflicted on Vietnam. So I don't think the accusation of anti Americanism can be leveled against him at all. A lot of his reporting in Hidden Agendas and in Heroes is in America, and he reports on people devastated by recessions in America. He reports on Black and Native American struggles in America, and white working class struggles in America. So his anti-Americanism, I think, is not a legitimate accusation there.
When you think of skyrocketing brands like Aloe, Allbirds, or Skims, it's easy to credit their success to great products, sleek branding, and brilliant marketing. But here's the overlooked secret. The real magic lies in the engine behind the scenes, the business powering their business. For millions of brands, that engine is Shopify, making selling seamless for them and shopping effortless for us. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Aloe Yoga uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/retail, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/retail to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/retail.
From Adams Morgan to Anacostia Park, we all want safer neighborhoods. But what does real safety mean? Real safety means preventing crime before it happens. By having police work with communities to disrupt cycles of violence. By supporting families with stable housing. And providing more mental health and drug treatment. We know that adding more police and locking up more people doesn't make us safer. Real safety means investing in the things that help prevent crime. Learn more at RealSafetyDC.
British magazines relied for their Vietnam coverage mostly on freelance journalists and photographers who visited Vietnam for short periods. Although these correspondents usually were usually not as well informed about the war as the resident men, they did have the advantage of a fresh eye for some of the stranger facets. In 1964, Brian Monahan, a freelance writer, interviewed Win Cao Kay, the then a not so well-known South Vietnamese Air Force officer, and was so struck by Kay's political views that he took careful note of them for the story. People ask me who my heroes are, Moynihan quoted Kay as saying. I have only one hero, Hitler. We need 4 or 5 Hitlers in Vietnam. When Kay became premier the following year, Moynihan dug out his earlier story and sold it to the Sunday Mirror, which displayed it prominently. At first, no American newspaper picked it up, but then the New York Times carried a report from its office in London, quoting the United States Embassy there as saying not only that Kay had never made such a statement about Hitler, but also that he denied ever having spoken to Moynihan. Unfortunately for the embassy and for the New York Times, the very day that this report appeared, Kay repeated the statement almost verbatim to the Reuters and BBC correspondents in Saigon. Neither British nor American correspondents did very well in writing about the unimaginable scale of corruption in Vietnam, perhaps because few correspondents claimed to be completely untainted themselves. Most of them changed dollars and pounds on the black market, and many bought stolen army goods, although one British correspondent said he felt things were going too far when a United States Army captain called on him in his hotel room within hours of his arrival in Saigon to ask whether he wanted to buy liquor, clothing, luggage, cameras, or electrical goods. In fact, as Murray Sale, in 1967, the correspondent for the Sunday Times of London, wrote, economic activity in the South has practically ceased, except for the war. Saigon is a vast brothel between the Americans who are trying more or less sincerely to promote a copy of their society on Vietnamese soil, and the mass of the population who are being reconstructed. Stand the fat cats of Saigon. When the full story of pilfering, theft, hijacking, bribery, smuggling, extortion, and black market dealings finally emerged, mainly through the United States Senate hearings in Washington, and in the case of opium smuggling in a series of articles by John Hughes in the Christian Science Monitor, the facts were staggering. In one case, South Vietnam, in one South Vietnam black market at Quy Nhon, thousands of cases of army sea rations, liquor, clothing, television sets, washing machines, and weapons and ammunition worth an unbelievable $11 million, sounds like chicken feed now, but I'm sure it wasn't at the time, changed hands every month. Vietnamese dealers offered to supply anything from a heavy-duty truck or an armored personnel carrier or a helicopter. One American subcontractor lost through pilfering over a 1 year period $118 million worth of goods. In 1967, 500,000 tons of imported American rice simply disappeared. Black market currency transactions were estimated to run to some $360 million a year. The CIA allowed Laotian generals to use its private airline, Air America, to smuggle opium. The United States Army's own police force, the Criminal Investigation Division, accused its senior officer, Major General Carl C. Turner, of refusing to permit it to investigate the dealings of a network of sergeants who personally profited from their operation of clubs for servicemen at Army bases. And finally, in the 3 fiscal years 1968 to 70, $1.7 billion authorized for the Saigon government pacification program was, according to the General Accounting Office, lost without a trace. As you probably can remember, this. I assume that you can, maybe you can't. I'm not sure, but the level of theft from the American occupying forces by not necessarily indigenous Iraqis, but by private contractors and from American servicemen themselves in Iraq following the occupation in 2003 was absolutely staggering. The talk of huge bricks of money just vanishing, being flown in to replace the kind of the defunct Iraqi currency, and to create a payroll for the American occupied zone. Bricks of money vanishing overnight, and the full story of that corruption, it will, I guess, probably never be fully told, but it certainly probably dwarfs what we talk about in Vietnam. And no doubt there were versions of this in the Korean War and the Second World War II, but I doubt on anywhere near the same scale. Most correspondents considered corruption stories peripheral to the war itself. It seemed to many of them that the more important to devote their time to the Army or the Marine Corps, to attach themselves to a unit going into action and to write about it, usually in simple Second World War terms. When the Marines first landed at Da Nang in 1965, American reporters spent weeks writing about leathernecks storming ashore, whereas they had walked up the beaches unopposed. Almost any action produced emotive comparisons. The biggest since Incheon, the second biggest since Normandy. This sort of reporting, mostly by veteran correspondents, injected a new feeling of badly needed confidence in victory, and was the model the United States authorities wished all correspondents would follow. Jim G. Lucas of the Scripps Howard Group is an example of this type of correspondent. Lucas, a Marine Corps combat correspondent at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Tarawa, had 8 battle stars, a Bronze Star, a Presidential Unit Citation, and a Distinguished Service Award of the Marine Corps League. he was not very impressed with the other correspondents in Vietnam when he first went there in 1964. In the 6 months I lived in the Delta, I was the only correspondent regularly assigned to working and living with combat troops. He wrote about the mud in the Mekong Delta, the conversation of GIs, the bravery of the Marines, the smell of cordite, and the companionship under fire, in short, snappy sentences interlaced with a simple war philosophy. You know it's war when you see a young man dead. Young men court danger as they court women, and for much the same reasons. Secretly, each wants to be a hero, in the finest and best sense of the word, and there's nothing wrong with that, because quiet heroism is the stuff of war. And it's that sort of kind of rhetoric, almost sort of slightly absurd rhetoric, that kind of mythologizes the true face of the conflict, in which it is a war in which the majority of the victims are civilians. The majority of people who died in South Vietnam, in North Vietnam, and in the remainder of Indochina are civilians. And it is to a greater extent, just as the Second World War was, just as the Korean War was, is a war fought against civilians. And this sort of kind of slightly macho kind of camaraderie and backslapping and sort of talk about, heroic death and that the nature of young men to court danger. It really does ignore those that were not seeking to court danger but have to face it anyway, normally not in conditions of a firefight, but in their towns and villages being napalmed. So it's about as far from John Pilger's view of war as it's possible to get.
For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.
Some correspondents, like Frank Harvey, were fascinated by the technical aspects of the war. Harvey went to Vietnam and wrote a long article for Flying magazine in 1966, which he later expanded into a book. Harvey lived and flew with the Americans piloting the wide range of aircraft involved in the air war in Vietnam, and he described how they operated and what they felt about the war. 90% gave me roughly the same answer. We have to stop communism, and we'd rather do it here in Vietnam than on the coast of California. One F-4 fighter bomber pilot in Da Nang told me that he thought we should start at the DMZ and kill every man, woman, and child in North Vietnam. Like Lucas, Harvey saw the war in straightforward terms. The United States is presently a world leader, and I believe we intend to keep it that way. We're prepared to fight and, if necessary, to hold on to what we've got and get more. In Vietnam, in South America, anywhere. Reporting like this had been quite adequate in the Second World War, where issues were more clearly discernible. Vietnam was a new kind of war and required a new kind of war correspondent. It was an interdisciplinary war where complex political issues intruded on the military aspects, where battle success was necessary, but where battle success alone was insufficient. A war where unwarranted optimism, propaganda, and news management could deeply obscure the issue. Ward Just of the Washington Post, a compassionate and conscientious correspondent, summed it up in this story. You will never be any more clear-headed than you are right now, an American major told a reporter driving in from Ta Son Hut Airport 30 minutes after his arrival in Vietnam. And the major, according to the reporter, had so far been right. Assessing the coverage of Vietnam, it seems clear that a primary requisite for this new war was for the correspondent to find some way of protecting his compassion. John Shaw has said, "Things which shocked you when you first went there, 6 weeks later, shocked you no more. It became easier to let horrifying things slide over you. There was lots of cynicism for you. There was lots of cynicism, and you could get very hard after a while." For American correspondents, Vietnam required the courage to face squarely the racist nature of the war and the effect this racism had on their fellow countrymen. It was no accident that the most damning indictments of this important aspect of the war did not come from American correspondents. All governments realize that to wage war successfully, their troops must learn to dehumanize the enemy. The simplest way to achieve this is to inflame nationalistic or racist feelings, or both. Thus, American racism, which had been first aroused on a national scale in the Second World War and then revived in Korea, reached a peak in Vietnam. But Vietnam was an insurgency war. The enemy was physically indistinguishable from the ally. Racist hate directed at Charlie Kong and the enemy made no provision for exempting those Vietnamese that the United States had intervened to save. In motivating the GI to fight by appealing to his racist feelings, the United States military discovered that it had liberated an emotion over which it was to lose control. Sartre has written that American racism, anti-Negro, anti-Mexican, anti-Asian, is a fundamental fact which goes very deep and which existed potentially or perhaps far long before the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, racism became a patriotic virtue. All Vietnamese became dinks, slopes, slants, or gooks, and the only good one was a dead one. So the Americans killed them when it was clear that they had that they were Viet Cong. I shot up at Charlie in the paddies today. Frank Harvey quotes an American helicopter pilot saying, "I ran that little mother all over the place, hosing him with guns, but somehow or other we just didn't hit him. Finally, he turned on us and stood there facing us with his rifle. We really busted his ass then. We blew him up like a toy balloon." So I'll leave you there. And this isn't to kind of single out America as this kind of uniquely monstrous colonial project and operator. If you look at accounts of France and Algeria, Britain in Kenya, if you look at accounts of Belgium in the Congo in the 1960s, colonial white racial chauvinism creates the same conditions and it relies on the same sentiments in order to enact them. So I'll return a bit more perhaps later in the week to Philip Knightley as we look at the war reporting of the My Lai massacre. And I'll leave you there. Thanks very much for listening. Take good care. All the best. Bye-bye.
From Adams Morgan to Anacostia Park, we all want safer neighborhoods. But what does real safety mean? Real safety means preventing crime before it happens. By having police work with communities to disrupt cycles of violence, by supporting families with stable housing, and providing more mental health and drug treatment. We know that adding more police and locking up more people doesn't make us safer. Real safety means investing in the things that help prevent crime. Learn more at RealSafetyDC.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.